When we think about briquettes or other short sidearms with a brass hilt, we often tend to think about the 19th century. And indeed, this is the heyday of this kind of weapon. So when we think about briquettes or fascinemessers or glaives, they usually kind of fall from the Napoleonic Wars well into perhaps maybe their kind of end of real use is around the Franco-Prussian War, then warfare starts changing a little. But let's say they're definitely still in use for other purposes as well, well into the 20th century as well. So we tend to think about them as a late kind of sword. However, that is not really the case. And we do have very examples of weapons that kind of fit those characteristics that date instead to the 18th century. Now, this one is not though one of those. This is more of composite, I think, although we'll kind of look at the details and some hypotheses when we look at the close-ups in this video. But the hilt, I wanted to just mention it quickly, definitely matches what would be the ancestor of the briquette. So this is a French model. It's often referred to as a briquette as well. And you find it in two variants, which are actually very similar, but they're the 1765 and 1776, if I'm not mistaken. The only real differences between the two, and I'm not really sure because you find, of course, different variants and descriptions are often rather vague online, but you'll have one version that has some langets. They're not really langets, but they're kind of only the hilt side, the grip side of the langet, and they're part of the brass cast, let's say, but they kind of have the effect of a langet here. And then you have versions like this one that don't have anything. But other than that, they're very similar in that they have this, I don't know how to describe it, but it has like a D guard here. And it's definitely not very reminiscent of the briquette. The briquette is kind of the rounded version of this. This is, you can see it's an early version, so it has some more square angles. And in fact, we could almost say it's a bit of a mix between the fascinemesser grip, so here with this kind of bulge over here that aids the grip, and the briquette with its knuckle guard. This, however, is not an official model. So the early briquettes you would see have similar blades to the briquette, so slightly curved and rather short. Whereas you'll see here we have a rather long blade instead that is really straight. So what this is, I'm not 100% sure. And the mystery is increased by the fact that we actually have a marking on the blade, the only marking on the sword actually, which says Harvey. So I know Harvey as a sword maker from England. However, well, we'll talk about it when we look at the details of the marking of the blade. But let's say the doubt here is whether this was some kind of a composite of the time, like a trophy blade perhaps, or if someone had maybe before the Napoleonic Wars and the bigger conflicts, not that there weren't conflicts between France and England even in the 18th century, but perhaps someone had preferred having an English blade on a French hilt, or the opposite. Maybe someone wanted a French. I don't know what it could be. The peen to me seems rather healthy, to be honest. So I can't really tell if it was tampered with, but it doesn't seem like an obvious composite. Moreover, the scabbard, or what's left of it, is definitely old and of historical time, let's say. So I don't know what it is, but we can discover it together. But before we dive into the close-ups, if you enjoy my videos, please like and subscribe. That really helps a lot. And with that, the self-promo is done for the video. So let's dive into the close-ups. And here we have our briquette. So we'll take a general look at the whole assembly and then dive more into the details of the sword itself. So if we look here, we have a scabbard, which is typically furnished with like a frog button here, so it would have been kept in a frog. The scabbard, you can see, is definitely old and is not in the best shape. Well, it's not in bad shape apart from the fact that it's missing a considerable portion towards the tip there. But other than that, it's not in the worst shape I've seen for scabbards. As we remove the blade here, it's not lined in wood or anything. This is just leather, and unfortunately it seems to me like it's getting some red rot. There's some leather rot, which, as far as I understand, and hopefully I post swords, has some news about it. I know he was looking into ways to preserve leather from it, but as far as I know, there's not much that can be done once it appears. As I mentioned, and as you'll probably see now, this is not your typical briquette. You'll see it has a rather long and rather straight blade, both characteristics that are not typical of briquettes. We can quickly measure it just to get an idea of what we're talking about. So from pommel cap here, like from pommel button here to tip, the sword is 84.5 centimeters, perhaps 86. And the blade length is, blade length would be 70.8 centimeters, let's say. So definitely longer than your average infantry sidearm, but not as long as you would see on a cavalry sword, for example. So let's take a look at the hilt. This is the typical hilt of a 18th century briquette, so an early briquette. It has most of the characteristics you will see. So one of the things that strikes me is, for example, the lack of perfectly rounded surfaces. When you look at the 19th century briquette instead of the Napoleonic one, everything is rounded. There's not one corner to be found on the hilt, essentially. Whereas here, we see a lot of rounded corners and rounded shapes, but overall it maintains a certain angularity, if that makes sense, a sort of kind of an edge to it. So we'll see, for example, that here on the back of the grip, there's this kind of central ridge that you can feel quite comfortably too. The general shape of the grip here is not dissimilar from what you see on Fascinemessers or on briquettes, so you have these kinds of ribs. Although I have the feeling that on this one they're more pronounced than you see on many other briquettes. And the briquettes, as I mentioned, I think in a previous video, they almost seem to sometimes overlap each other, whereas here they're way more well-defined, but still very rounded. And then we have a quillon that jots straight out here and kind of continues here to form a cross guard. You'll see it's kind of a rhombic section a little that thickens towards the middle and then thins again towards the end. But then instead of having a second quillon here, it converts directly into the knuckle guard. Interestingly, the knuckle guard has this kind of acutely curved end here that ends in the ribs here rather than at the end of the pommel, which, I don't know, would be where I would make it end. But still, the hilt has a rather elegant design to it, I would say. It looks very beautiful. The pommel cap, or the pommel end here, ends with a extra, like a faux cap. So this is part of the casting. It's not a separate section, but you see it's kind of added onto the end of the pommel, whereas a Fascinemesser would end without this, for instance. And then we have this extra button here, which is rather prominent. It's 1.5 centimeters. And here's where we find the pin. So if we look at this one, you'll see that the tang here has had time to age. So it's definitely not a kind of modern composite or anything. Of course, the scabbard also kind of testifies to it being a older kind of change or modification. There are some hammer blows or something, but of course they would be expected, because this is definitely not a sword that was assembled in this way in the royal manufactories of France. And why can we say that? Well, it's because of this one mark we see here. You'll see there a Harvey. Now, there are a number of French makers who do have similar marks, in the sense like rectangular punch with the name. I'm not sure of English makers that have the same kind of mark in terms of the lettering, but Harvey is definitely an English maker, both because the name is English, of course, but also there is an attested sword maker of the time who was called Harvey. The only thing that doesn't make a lot of sense here, though, is that I haven't seen this format of the mark connected to any of Harvey's work. Harvey has different marks. One which is normally very recognizable is a fox, so a bit of a running fox, I think, sort of variant to the Passau wolf, I imagine. And then I think he has like an H or some monograms, but not this kind of extended lettering. So if you have any insights as to what it may be, I would be very, very curious to know. Another thing that attests, I think, to this blade being an old addition to this hilt is the remains here of the washer. This is, I think, felt or some kind of red fabric, but it's quite compromised by now. Moving on to the blade. The blade is, I would say, actually quite beautiful. Now, never mind my fingerprints, which I'll wipe off when we finish the video, but you may notice that it's actually quite an elaborate blade for being attached to this humble hilt. So it's straight. It has one long fuller. When I say long, I really mean it in the sense that this one runs all the way right to the last couple of millimeters at the tip. This is really interesting because this is how it was designed, of course. It's not a shortened blade. They wouldn't have been able to kind of maintain the fuller end here and then shape the tip in a spear tip like this. So this was designed this way, and I think it's a very beautiful shape for a blade. And then we'll see a second fuller, which starts kind of where the first one starts, and is thinner and, well, more narrow. And I'm not sure if it's deeper. That's hard to tell because of, yeah, I'll have to clean that, of course. But it runs kind of all the way up the blade as well, but kind of tapers out here around the natural point of a false edge for a blade. So the last 10, 15 centimeters perhaps. What makes this second fuller really interesting, though, is that it's right on the edge of the spine of the blade. And this means that this little ridge here is extremely, almost sharp. It almost feels like a T-bar. It isn't, because this is material that has been removed, but it almost feels like you have a thick section here, like a wide section, and then a flat part of the blade. And it's not. It's just that the fuller has been cut so close to the edge that it kind of gives that impression. You feel this ridge here, which is really unique, I find, and it just feels very sturdy and high quality, I would say. Now, if I run my hand here on the blade, occasionally you do feel some imperfections, some like wobbliness in the steel, but it's very minor. And yeah, you can't really feel it all the time. It's just a very, very well-made blade, I feel. You'll see the flat spine I mentioned here runs all the way up to, well, essentially where the second fuller tapers out almost. So here becomes a false edge. So it's not sharp, but it could have been sharpened potentially. Otherwise, you have a rather thick spine here of the blade, and this makes for what is essentially a very stiff blade. So I'm not applying huge force, but I'm definitely applying a force. And up to the half point of the blade, there is essentially, well, functionally no flex whatsoever. And as you move up, it increases ever so slightly. It does flex a little bit, but really not that much, up to, let's say, the last 20, 25 centimeters of the blade. So very stiff, very pointy. These fullers add a lot of, well, weight reduction, but also a lot of stiffness to the blade. And overall, a lovely, lovely blade. It's sharp in this section, so actually here I should probably be a little more careful in handling it. Although I don't think it would cut. I don't see any service sharpening marks, like, maybe you can see some final grinding there, but it's hard to say if this is just part of the, no, I think this is a sign of sharpening. Yeah. Definitely feels sharp at the tip, but a interesting sword. I don't have an explanation for this, as I mentioned, so I'd be happy to hear your hypothesis. But what I can say is that if I had this over traditional briquette, I think I would be quite happy, because this sword seems to maintain the stiffness and the ruggedness, let's say, of the briquette, but it transforms it from, let's say, a stout machete almost, into an actual sword with some reach and I think some elegant fencing potential as well. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed this sword. Let this be a reminder to not discount composite or unusual swords that aren't the typical regulation model, because sometimes you'll find interesting surprises where you least expect them. If you made it to here, please like and subscribe. That really helps the channel. And other than that, I'll see you in the next sword video. Bye!